Hi, and welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. I'm Chris Lucian, and with us is Austin Chadwick, and I have the pleasure of introducing Michael Feathers today. Michael, do you want to give us a little description about yourself and your impacts on the software community, and maybe we can get into the discussion?
Yeah, sure. That sounds good. Yeah, I guess the thing I'm best known for within the industry is basically writing a book, I guess about 15 years ago called Working Effectively with Legacy Code. And I spent a great deal of my career kind of like helping teams kind of move past issues of technical debt, things along those lines. So I have my own company, R7K Research and Conveyance, but I'm also the chief architect of Globant. Yeah, in terms of topics, it's kind of funny about legacy code that you can't spend much time dealing with it before you start getting really curious about how it happens. And then that goes and gets you into the entire realm of all kinds of aspects of software process and practice. So I enjoy that area,
Yeah,
quite wide, I guess.
And so I guess kind of just jumping right in a little bit, so those dynamics and team organization, sizing, specialization. What are your thoughts on that and related to legacy code and other aspects of software development?
Yeah, no, it's quite a wide range of things. It just kind of dawned on me a long time ago that when code goes bad, it's like there's a reason, right?
Yeah.
And it's weird with this too, because I think some people basically take the tack that it's kind of like, if you are a professional, then your code is always good and you have to basically just keep on applying diligence, right? But I think a big turning point for me was to kind of like really start to internalize Conway's law, where basically Mel Conway made the observation that essentially if you have like three teams, you're going to basically end up with an architecture that has three major pieces just because of the communication patterns. And there's no accident in that at all. It's just, it has to do with the fact that essentially our environment, the people we're working with, how we organize ourselves, the tools that we use, all these things impact, the systems that we produce. And so if there are quality problems, then that basically means that there's something going on and it's worth digging into. And so that kind of like, as much as I'm a bit of a code head, it's like, I always look at code as being like when you chop a tree in half and you basically look at the rings inside, you can go and get a sense, of what's happening in the organization just because of the fact that, it has an impact. It's all one thing.
I love that analogy. That's, it's really funny because I think, when I've seen individuals working on separate projects kind of coalesce and start mobbing, Conway's law asserts itself pretty heavily, and then projects with multiple mobs end up kind of creating even multiple microservices, and so it kind of reasserts itself again in that space. And so I've seen those sorts of things, and then I've seen the opposite where code quality goes poorly because there's different things happening with the organization. What are some patterns that I think you've seen that have both caused poor code quality and patterns that you've seen that have created better code quality?
Yeah, it's interesting because as you were telling that story about mobs coming together or siloed teams coming together and then the things that happen with that, it reminds me of something I kind of noticed across time in the industry that's kind of hard to talk about in a way, because it's kind of like, unless you've experienced the alternative, you're not really like aware of where things can go. And I think I'll carry it back to Conway's law, right? It's kind of like if your code quality is kind of messed up, maybe it means something about what you're doing day to day. And if we see separate teams producing separate code as like being one form of the mirroring of Conway's law, there's this other aspect in which the quality of the communication that we have really affects the quality of the code in a very direct way, right? And I think, the most apparent thing to me with this is if we lack directness in giving feedback about, what code can be in a way. So often I'll work with people and then it's kind of like we're pairing on something or working together on something. And then it's kind of like we get into this groove, and then it's kind of like you look at something and you're kind of like, that could be a bit better. And then you're thinking to yourself, should I mention that at all? Right. And then you do mention it. And then the other person's kind of like, yeah, it's kind of thinking that also, but I didn't really want to bring it up. And it's kind of like, it felt like it would be disrespectful in a way to go and actually talk about how this particular thing could be better that you're investing time in. Right. So it's like this space in which we really just sort of like get very direct about, I see a better way of doing this, or we can do better than this. Let's go ahead and kind of like amp things up. I think that when we don't really have the psychological safety to allow that kind of thing to happen, code just deteriorates, and on the other hand, it's like you can get into this virtuous circle where basically everybody's kind of like trying to raise the bar by going and saying, it's like, this looks really good, but I think they can make it better this way. And then everybody gives just that person the opportunity to go and make their case and,
when I first started mobbing, this was, again, it was siloed teams. Things were managed, I think, previously in a very waterfall way, and we were kind of in the middle of a transition to more agile type work.
Yeah.
And during retrospective, it became very apparent while we were working that criticism of the code that somebody else wrote was going to be a way of life from now on. And so, one of the developers, which I just really loved this response, was just like, let's create a working agreement around treating each other with kindness, consideration, and respect.
Yeah.
And, we weren't really throwing around the term psychological safety back then. This is 9.5 years ago now.
Yeah.
But it kind of spoke to this whole idea of, when you're pairing, when you're mobbing, and you look at somebody's code that they wrote years ago, and you're saying there's a better way, you're in a way criticizing that person's work. And if people don't hold the belief that everybody did the best that they could with the tools that they had at the time, and if there's blame assigned, then that just all falls apart, right? And that's kind of a social norm in some software development shops too.
Yeah. And it's weird with that because there is something rather deep about it. I remember years ago, maybe like 5-6 years ago or something like that, reading some article online or some blog, and it was talking about there was like, it was seen as, I guess, toxicity to basically sort of like start to really ding PHP, right? And to go and basically have like, jokes about how bad the language is and stuff like that. And people making the case of like, oh, okay, but you don't understand, people are basically working in this language and we don't want them to feel bad about this particular thing. I remember looking at that and saying, yeah, I agree. I kind of see that, but there's also this way in which we can be respectful of the people, but also go and recognize that, the people and the tools are two separate things in a way, right? And much in the same way with code, it's kind of like we all invest our heart and soul in the things that we do a bit, but there's also this thing of going and recognizing that it's something other than us.
Yeah.
And that it's kind of like that criticism or trying to make that particular thing better. We can have a little bit of distance there that goes and allows us to go and basically see that as a thing that can get better independently of us in a way, right? I realize I'm talking very abstractly about this, but I think it's really a matter of like an orientation in a way towards the things that we produce. One thing that happened early in my career in the 1990s was I was working with a guy, and we were very siloed back then, working in separate cubicles on separate projects. And he'd spent like 3 months working on a project by himself. And then the company did like a U-turn and said, well, we don't really need this anymore. And he was given a new task to go and work on. And he nearly quit the industry because he was so invested in this thing that he had created. And I remember saying to myself at that moment, it's kind of like, okay, don't love what you make, love what you do.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you can have that kind of attitude, then it's a little bit less fragile than basically ending up in this space where you feel like you're ready to give up an entire career because of business decision, I guess,
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's something to that, I think.
Yeah, and I think I've seen it done well in many mobs I've been with, where we're looking at a piece of code that's maybe 10, 15 years old. And people will say like, maybe they had a good reason to call it this, at the time, and they probably did. But what do you think about running an experiment to name it this instead, or something like that? And I think if you, it doesn't always make it feel nice. Like maybe that person could overhear that and was still offended, but at least an attempt at showing respect was made, right? And but also, as you said, the continuous improvement. Let's make it better. And I think modeling it as well, right? So when I say, hey, let's name it this, I'm not so sure about this name and I'm open to ideas, but let's start with this as an experiment, right? And it kind of opens the door for that feedback to flow. And I just love this whole concept you're bringing up. And I think it came up on social media the other day where it was a post about kind of craftsmanship and well-named things. And someone said, I wish all developers knew how to write code like this, with what good names or something like that. And then someone replied and said, well, maybe they did. It's just the system they're in didn't allow it, right? We don't know what pressures they were put on, or if communication is really poor. I love what you said about that. Like, if I have a poor relationship with understanding the domain, how can I put the domain into the code? I don't even understand it, right? And so, I feel like that's a common theme is people love code and then they end up spending their careers on people because it's inevitable.
Definitely.
So you mentioned that kind of pairing experience kind of helped improve code. Kind of the other hand of Chris's question, what things have you seen that has caused that kind of people stuff to go poorly to make code worse?
I think the main breakdown sometimes is, well, when you have like wildly different ideas of what good is, I think that can be a bit of a problem. And I think, for y'all, like with mobbing and everything like that, it's like you have to kind of like arrive at something like that, or else you just can't really work together at all, right? You have to go and get a common sense of what good looks like. So there's that, and then there's also, people talk about power differentials quite often. But there's that thing of like just not being forthright about, like your opinion about which way things should go. And then I think it's like, it's weird about this because it's like all relationships, I think, right? In the world, it's kind of like, if you kind of hold back and don't say anything, then you feel bad about it. And then you feel disconnected. If you're able to go and raise your voice and sort of like, get to the point where you can find common ground and reconciliation, then it's great. And, again, that's stuff that kind of reflects itself back in the code if we don't really handle it between ourselves, well enough, I think.
I've actually, kind of to key off of that a little bit, I've seen I've been in an environment where two teams were being compared to each other by a CEO, and one team's code, looked really good, and the other one, the quality was becoming more and more poor. And so I actually think that, those teams might have communicated and made the code better together had they not been pit against each other, right? And so, and again, this kind of goes back to the Conway's law thing. It's the organizational structure. If everybody has kind of the proverbial gun pointed at each other for different teams, then the level of stress for one team versus another ends up coming up, and your code ends up resulting in fracturing like that and things like that. So
if there's an interface between those two pieces of code by those two different teams, it's kind of interesting when I ask, well, what does that interface look like now?
And those people talking to each other, trying to communicate, if there's resentment held, which became very evident that one team resented another, and even then it was just the integrations ended up taking much longer than they could have, and the communication broke down. It ingrained itself in the code. And so psychological safety in general, this ability to give feedback without reprimand or without fear of reprimand is just so incredibly important, in my opinion.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think one thing that I'm keep coming back to every once in a while is that there's an attitude that I've seen some artists take towards the things that they create, which is kind of like, you're looking at that particular piece of stone or that statue you're working on, and you're saying, what does this thing want to be, right? And then it's kind of like that, and it sounds kind of weird, doesn't it? But it's like I feel that there's something to that kind of thing of like, okay, well, it's not really about us as much as like, let's go ahead and sort of like ascribe to this thing that we're creating the quality of wanting to be healthy, or we want it to basically be to sort of like flower in the way that it's supposed to in order to be a fit to the environment and the requirements and the things that we have in place. And at that point, it's kind of like you're really focusing on a common task together, and then it's kind of like it becomes a little bit less personal. It's more about, we are making this thing that is together that's going to be really cool, and so it's, I keep coming back to it. I always feel weird talking about this because it sounds so metaphysical in a way, but I think the orientations that we have towards the mindset that we have around the work that we do, can make things a lot better sometimes.
Yeah, and what was the phrase you said? What does this thing want to be, basically, or what does
Yeah.
this piece start want to be? Another way I heard it too was in an extreme programming training where it was said, it was talking about how some chefs are able to keep their knives really sharp without sharpening all the time.
Interesting.
And it was because they were cutting at the grooves or at the right points of the food, so to speak, right? So they weren't dulling their knife. And so it's kind of like, what does this product want to be? What are the right grooves or what are the right seams? I could inject a pattern here that doesn't fit the domain at all, right? And then I'm going to have a really dull knife, right? So,
yeah.
But I like changing it from me to the product. I think that's really cool. So one follow-up question to the metaphysical comment you just made, which is, I've seen it happen quite a bit, where people love code, they love tech, and then you have someone saying, hey, people stuff's important and organization, and then they just tune out because they're just like, okay, I didn't come here to do people stuff. But as we're talking about, it becomes really important, right? The organization, the dynamics, the system, how people interact. What are things you've seen help bridge the gap for people who are very tech focused and feel like the people stuff is nonsense?
Well, it sounds like we're talking about my career journey, because I basically started out that way. One thing I mention every once in a while is that in school, I was like so shy. I basically thought I would basically become like a pharmacist, because I wouldn't even have to look people in the eye when I'm actually like filling prescriptions or something, right? It's just a matter of going in, putting the proper pills in the proper bottles, and just like, that's my 8 hours. I'll do that, right? And it took me a while, being extremely tech focused, to kind of like figure out how to really work with people. And it's, I guess it's a bit of kind of like a journey for many people to go really deep into tech. I'm finding that people basically enter the industry now a lot more well-rounded than they did in the past, at least in my pocket of experience. I think just because we've understood that it really is that important. And also it's really hard to go and get a job now where you're going to do something extremely siloed. You're going to have to interact with people in order to go and actually make anything of value these days. My first job was designing a programming language and writing a compiler. I sat for like 3 to 4 months in a cubicle and did that by myself, with like just one guy who was my boss to go and bounce ideas off of. And it's like, it's a very, very different experience than what most people, encounter today. And pretty much you have to step into a social space in just practically every place you're in the industry right now. So you can have your tech focus and stuff like that, but it's kind of like, there's no getting past the fact that it's more than just you working on the project, right? So.
Yeah. So it's basically inevitable.
I think so. I know that for me, at least, like, I was aware of computing in the 80s, didn't really get into it until the 90s or so. But in those early days, you really had people who just wanted to go and just, I guess relatively antisocial, just like sit in the cube and work on something by themselves. If that still happens, I'm not really seeing too much of it, but it'd be great to go and actually find out if it still is. Then I can update my understanding of what's happening in the industry.
I think at the very least, the movement is in the direction of more social development.
Yeah.
But I don't know if it's, I think that, when we have people visit, the mob programming spaces and things, there are still groups out there that are like, I don't know how anybody can work this way, and they're surprised, but and then they see it and they witness it for a while and they're like, oh, this makes a lot of sense. So I think just in general, podcasts like this one, just talking about it and getting it out there, getting people talking about it, I think has been.
I think one thing that kind of gets me a little bit with this is that, even though we've taken this big move into understanding how the social systems and the people systems are so vital and important in the industry, that sometimes I feel like some of the tech stuff, or the stuff that encompasses both tech and social, kind of gets thrown by the wayside a little bit, you know, and it's a weird thing with that, because I feel like everybody's trying to push into the people space, and I'm kind of like, oh, well, you know, it's like, let's go and see the system as a whole in order to go and actually, you know, deal with these things.
Right.
But yeah, it's kind of funny.
And then there's the aspect of you know, higher level leaders like executives and stuff too, and there's a lot of cascading effects that come from that level, and also grassroots movements in general as well. So yeah, the entire system is very sociotechnical, I guess.
Yeah,
So to use the phrase that you'd used. But so regarding the socio-technical system, you know, how is that mapped out for you? What does that look like? Experience?
Yeah, it's wild. I go back to Conway's law periodically just because I feel that almost to be like a foundational thing in terms of understanding those spaces and things. The one of the things that I think a lot about these days is this concept. I don't really have a word for except maybe the word activation, I guess, in a way. And I tend to be a very visual thinker, so often I'll think about a code base as if it was like some big terrain that you can kind of like wander across, right? And then you've got areas that you're touching very frequently and areas that you're not touching quite as often. And then there's this thing, maybe you can see the mob as like a wandering horde that goes across the plains and does various different things, right? So it seems that one of the basic things about software development is that if you have a group of people that are working on something that can kind of like, you know, they can get to know it very, very well because it isn't too big, then the work's going to go along and basically just, you know, kind of like move along at a very good pace and stuff. It seems like once things grow past a certain span, then it's like if you're a mob, you know, or a team, there's going to be areas that you haven't touched in 7 months or 8 months, for instance. If you have to go back in there, you're going to touch those things. And to me, it's almost like looking at a city at night. And it's like you have the lights that go on and then basically they go off and they kind of like fade out a little bit, right? So like there's a level of knowledge that is active within a particular code base. And if you're in there touching it frequently, that level of knowledge grows. But then the areas that basically get less attention, that activation is going to start to deteriorate over time, right? So I don't know quite what to do with that except to say that that's a way of kind of maybe visualizing what happens and what one of the basic tensions we have in software development is. It's like the work is going to carry us in different areas of the system, but there's going to be areas that have been left alone in the dark for a long period of time. And then the question becomes, how do we work with those things? You know, so yeah, a lot of what I have sometimes is not like, hey, do this, but like, here's a way of looking at things that might lead to ways of doing things, right? So that's something that's been on my mind a bit recently. I just to float something with that slightly is I remember having an idea years ago about like a tool that might do a repository analysis, for instance, and sort of like say to people, send you an email and say, you know, hey, Chris, you know, you should really talk to Austin, you know, and maybe get together and just talk about this particular area, just because the tool figures out you've both been in this area, probably had different experiences of it, and could reconcile your opinions of things.
Oh, fascinating.
So
I like that.
it would be a wild way of going and sort of like giving the entire system awareness of like when people's different, you know, proclivities might need to be reconciled in a way that are going to keep the entire system healthy. Anyway.
Yeah. Go work on your relationship because you're going to be clashing a lot soon.
Yeah, or just like, you know, maybe you see things from a completely different point of view because you've been working on different features in the same area, right? And it's kind of like, then maybe from metric spaces, it's kind of like there's a recognition that like clash of styles maybe, or, you know, maybe like some things are growing that maybe shouldn't be growing relative to other things in the code base. You know, I think there's a lot of avenue around that stuff we could possibly explore.
That's fascinating. I love that idea.
Yeah, so maybe it's like I'm thinking of like a thing you can analyze in a Git repo would be like high churn plus multiple authors, you know, whether it's a mob or a person, right? You know, because that means, you know, maybe these mobs or people should talk to each other because they're both touching the same area a lot and probably doing a bit of like, you know, back and forth and not knowing it. And I think even though you said you're more in the less, do X space, you know, if If we think about our socio-technical systems, am I saying that word right? It's a word I'm learning today. And you're thinking about how do we work effectively with legacy socio-technical systems? What are things we can do? And even though, like what you said, is not like, here's this step-by-step plan, visualizing the problem and raising awareness of it is one thing, right? And so like the city metaphor, I think can really resonate with people. Some sort of tool, like you mentioned, that kind of identifies socio-technical problems. I'm trying to brainstorm on anything else that has kind of helped with these legacy socio-technical systems where
well, I can bring something else up that I think is really kind of powerful. I'd like to get more people to try it. I had at a conference talk years ago, I mentioned something I called quality views, which is really about going and actually like depicting the quality of the system in a non-quantitative way to help people sort of like make decisions around things, right? And a guy named Colin Brecht basically tried this out at his company. And what the tack that he took with this was to go and basically have like a bit of a component diagram showing the major pieces of the system, and then going and using colors to go and indicate the relative health of those different areas, right? And the idea behind this is to go and sort of like when people in product are basically deciding on features, to go and have them, don't sort of like say, well, we can't do this because of this. Look at that over there, right? It's more to just sort of like refer to the diagram periodically when you're going and talking about feature selection and stuff like that, and go and say, oh yeah, by the way, this might take a little bit longer because you'll see this area is getting kind of red, but it's also, this feature is going to touch this other area too, which is a little bit in the healthier state. So yeah, we can write this done in 2 weeks or something like that. And just by going and having those conversations with a prop of this thing that's going and having like a bit of a qualitative assessment of the different areas, what you do is you end up going and raising the awareness of the reality of the systems underneath with the people you're interfacing with in the business. Because it does seem that we're really aware of this giant landscape of the code that we're working on day to day, but at a certain level in the organization, it's really features and teams, right, and projects. And it's, at that level, it's kind of like, it's very easy to forget that there's this underlying thing that's being worked on, and its qualities impact what we're able to do, right? It's kind of like, if we kind of treat this poorly after 6 months or a year or so, it becomes really hard to go and work with these things, and kind of massaging communication in that way.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And what's interesting about that is I've seen tools that do this, and I'm not sure what your friend did there, but this is dating my knowledge a little bit, because last time I did it was about 5 years ago. But there's a tool called Sonar Cube, and it will color, and it's kind of starts at a high level. So it'll be like, here's repo A, B, and C, and then you click into repo A, and then it'll be like, here's the different components in that repo, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, there's data that's more or less trustworthy, right? So you can color the different components as you drill down through the system by code coverage, by number of static analysis issues or things like that. And even while that data is not everything, right? Like green code coverage may not mean it's actually well tested. But if a component is completely red, that plays a lot into a conversation, right? Like, oh, this feature is going to involve this component or this legacy code that was written 20 years ago and has no tests. That changes how we would go about that work a lot.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think I guess the one flip on that I have is that, like, you can use a tool like that in order to go and do these things. But one of the things I often say, it's really good for the developers themselves to go and actually make those assessments and decide on the shade of color themselves. Just because it's kind of like, there's, metrics are great, but it's kind of like they're not determinative in a way. It's kind of like, everybody has a sense of what the difficult areas of the code are to work in and stuff along those lines. And, we really are paid for our expertise, and to the degree that we're actually able to go and sort of like take all that information and kind of like synthesize it in a way that goes and, presents our assessment of the difficulty of working in this area, then we're in a cool space. So, yeah.
I like that a lot, because I've seen it other places. Metrics like that get very much abused in a socio-technical system.
And worse than that too, it's like then it's like what you're doing is you're basically passing authority to the tool sometimes in conversation, saying, well, it's like, don't take my word for it, the tool says this, right? So you're doing that, and it's kind of like you undermine yourself, because really, as developers, we're the ones who we're not paid for our typing skills. We're paid for being able to make these judgments that basically reflect themselves in the things that we're making, every day. So
yeah, and I have that tendency too to weigh qualitative from people who've been in the field more. That's a harder sell with certain audiences, though.
Yeah, and it's really so much of this, since it is a communication tool. It really depends on who you're communicating with and whether they're willing to play ball in a way, right? So
right, definitely.
I wanted to kind of back up a little bit and ask about the organization sizing specifically. So what are your thoughts there? Like, is there a too big, too small? Is it, how does that play into all, the size of an organization? How does that play in your mind into the things that we've been talking about?
Oh, yeah, that's kind of wild. In terms of the entire organization, I don't think it really even matters all that much. I think that the main thing really is the size of the area with which you have to exercise, control, or the area you have to go and work in, right? Are you really working past people's cognitive load, for instance? And a typical thing when we want to do bigger things within the industry is to go and modularize, right? So we basically create, separate, groupings of microservices or whatever in order to go and actually have a set of people that establish domain knowledge in a particular area and kind of get to know the code very well. So that's good, but I think it even goes further than that. What I love seeing organizations do is kind of get into the frame of mind where they're thinking about adding features onto an existing product, and there might be decent market reasons for doing that sort of thing, but can you at least internally conceptualize it as a separate product, and what does that look like? It's a typical thing to go and basically sort of like hit yourself onto success in the market and grow something out. But the thing that's interesting to recognize is that has costs over time, and scale hurts, in many different ways. So it's like this choice between making a giant thing, okay, that's presented to the market as a one product, and creating a bunch of things, some of which are going to do very well and other things not quite so much. I think sometimes we need a little bit more bias in that direction towards making smaller things. One of my favorite stories around this is SQLite. That essentially it's like I think about a 2-person team that's been working for 20 years on this product in a way, and they know it intimately. They basically they comment all their code. I remember seeing a presentation the other day where somebody mentioned that that it's kind of like we're writing code not for people that haven't been born yet, right? So it's kind of interesting to be in that space where everything is it's almost like a sweet spot in development where you can write all the tests you want to, and you get to know the code very well, and you can take experiments and stuff like this, and that people are going to be around for another 10 years, right? So it's like that's an ideal state, and we're never really that way in the industry. So we have to basically do all these compensating measures to kind of get things to work at scale. And I think it's nice to go and sort of recognize that we're working against ourselves sometimes with scale, and when we have the opportunity to do some smaller things, then it's kind of cool.
Nice.
How about specialization? Because I think that was in the kind of the same thread.
Yeah.
How does specialization play into it? And are we talking about specialization versus generalization, or how does that?
Well, yeah, I know. It's kind of a funny thing with that too, because I haven't really done all that much mobbing, right? Yeah. So a lot of pairing and stuff along those lines. And I think one of the things that I always wonder about with this is, can you get into a group think space that kind of decreases creativity to some degree, right? And I think that's inevitable over time when people kind of like work together, that sort of thing happens. I think like rotating people between teams is a very decent thing to kind of maintain some variety in what happens in a way.
It's really interesting. I can kind of speak to that a little bit. We have about 27 people or so, and early on it was kind of like the same people in a mob, and every time we brought somebody in to one mob, it ended up kind of upending, or it was an injection of creativity, right? Because you get into a groove of like having the same people, and so there are a number of rules that kind of came about as things moved forward. So some for the team in general. So currently it's kind of like the capital gains tax law. You can't stay on the same mob for more than 2 years within the last 3 years, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
That gets people kind of moving from time to time between products, right? Not mobs. And then the multi-mob products are regularly rotating or randomizing people between tasks, some weekly, some daily, some, and so there's a lot of like randomization and then obviously the department itself has like natural turnover. So then there's people coming completely outside, from the outside. And so that's been really interesting, is just the shift in perspectives. And and mobbing kind of allows for, I think, what people are usually worried about with turnover in general is like onboarding and just getting people familiar with the domain. So just in our experience, I think the team in general, there's a few exceptions, but the team in general values randomness and that regular shifting in general.
Yeah, that brings something to mind. The thing I was mentioning a bit before about like activation, like in the landscape of your code base, right? It seems like another way of approaching this is to go and say, well, look at like the domain knowledge as being like this quantity that you want to conserve and not dissipate too quickly, right? So then the thing becomes kind of like, well, you want to allow people to move, but basically sometimes you can't basically move more than a certain number of people or a certain, a set of people, at once without things being really adversely affected, right?
We actually, we ran that experiment forcibly. And while there was a lot of pain, a lot of people were still in the department, because this was when the very first time we put in place the rule that you had to leave a product after 2 years. There were a number of people that were essentially on the product for more than 2 years. And rather than doing it piecemeal, they kind of did it all at once. And so, yeah, it was really fascinating. There was a lot of learning, a lot of discussion between the two groups of people. But, one thing that, when people are talking to me about, it was like, oh, well, if you have this like specialist, then they're going to know what to do all the time, and your code base will move forward really fast. And then I'm like, and then it will stop if they left the company. One benefit of moving people around while they're at the same company is that they're still around for questions. And so that exchange of information, and that, I think that activation actually ends up coming up from time to time. And so the legacy knowledge is still within the company, and those questions can still be answered, but now pieces of it are all over the place, and there's some copies of that information kind of circulating around, readily at hand. So
I guess it really depends on the broader company culture that basically it's cool to reach out to people, and
that's very frustrating for the people involved in that transition. I think there were many in that group that shifted all at once. They said, we want to rip the Band-Aid off, and there was obviously a lot of frustration, but the team afterwards was a lot stronger for it.
That's very cool. And I think there's that other thing too, that I guess it gets back to an earlier point, is like right now it seems like a lot of places in the industry will say like, okay, y'all are like software developers and you use your best judgment, and like, how do you want to develop your skills? What do you want to do? Do you want to go to this team or that team? That kind of stuff, right? And that's good, but it's also kind of like there can be this other focus of like, hey, what does the system need, right? It's kind of like, I hate working this particular area, but it does really need me for a period of time. So I'll bite the bullet and do 3 months here, and then hopefully we get things to a point cross-skilled so that I can go off and do other things. And it's kind of like this focus on the other of it, that ethic can help a little bit too.
The two things is what Chris just mentioned, what you just mentioned. I lived both of those recently. So so once I joined a mob that all 3 people on the mob had been there less than 3 months, but the domain was still in the company, right? And so it teaches you a whole set of skills. Sometimes the hard way, sometimes an easier way, where you say like, to admit when you don't know, right? And say like, we'll try for a while, we'll try some ideas, but then let's bring in the domain person and have them mob with us and teach us, right? And so it kind of, I think it teaches you humility, and teaches you it's okay to ask for help, and things like that. And I think it teaches you skills that are helpful whenever you're thrown in that kind of situation, right? And to bring in the safety if you don't have the safety in house, right? And then bring it in long enough so it transfers. And then the system thing too was, once I was on that mob for a while, I was loving what I was doing. There was a need in another team, and it was kind of like, oh, I feel like I'm in this perfect sweet spot, but the system called for it, and so it, and it was worth it. And basically, you have to reset and do all that all over again. Like, I just felt like I just got this domain down. Now I'm jumping into something completely different. But the more you do it, the less scary it gets, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. And and that's just, most things in life in a way. And it's, it really, I think that's one thing that's really cool about our industry, is that essentially for anybody who's looking to increase their value and skills, there's usually opportunities to basically just do something a little bit different and step out of your comfort zone a little bit and gain some new skills and quite often you don't have to do this, it just happens. Right? It's kind of like, oh no, we really need this sort of thing, we need, it's like, okay, here I am.
And I think going back to the groupthink thing, I think the switching can help with that, but also almost being pedantic about it, almost overstating it, is the psychological safety piece. Going right back to where we started early in the conversation, is just constantly saying, like, because I think it's easy, let's say you have a senior engineer on the team who knows the domain, knows the code, to just be like, oh, I know what to do. And then they just keep going. And then the rest of the pair, the mob, just keeps kind of going along with it. But to constantly challenge that, to be saying, like, either be silent or to say, I have an idea, but challenge it. There's got to be a better way. You know what I mean? Give us another option. You know what I mean? And constantly be inviting feedback.
Yeah, definitely.
And what I've found is that all levels, senior, junior, mid, etc., if you ask enough and demonstrate enough of it, vulnerability, they will give it to you. Like, I've seen you navigate this a few times and I've gone along with it, but I just have to say, I find it incredibly unreadable when you do this pattern. Like, I'm having trouble following what's going on here. And they'll be like, oh yeah, I did refactor to a pattern here. And then someone else will be like, why don't we just do B? And it'd be like way simpler. It's not necessarily a fancy pattern, but it's understandable to everyone involved. And so I think just constantly challenging and asking for feedback is one way to fight it.
Definitely.
And I think we should move to architectural issues and addressing them before we run out of time today.
Yes.
And so, architecture issues. What do you do to, or what would your plan be to address them, or maybe what would you recommend to somebody for addressing them?
Yeah, such a broad question. I mean, architectural issues covers just about everything, right?
It could be social, it could be technical.
Lean on Conway and say, hey, we just talked about teams, so it's the same thing, right? But it's I think there's a big thing around this, which is really, if you have the typical thing is like monoliths to microservices, and people have been doing that for quite a while now in the industry, and I think we've got decent support in the industry for how to do that, how to approach that kind of work. More generally with architecture, I think the thing I keep coming back to over and over again in many different contexts where there are problems is separating the essential from the stuff which isn't quite so essential in terms of like your domain, right? So quite often, even if you're re-architecting things, you can find the things that really, really matter, and you can kind of choose to bolster those up, and then kind of like reuse them in different contexts, and move from one architectural style to another. So I don't really know that I have much more to say about it than that, but I think it's recognizing that all code is not really equal in a project, right? And that there's some code that has far more value in a domain, and it's important to go and recognize what that is and have that factor into your plans for how you want to push things forward.
Yeah, and maybe one specific follow-up question is, you mentioned you're in an architect role. How do you see yourself in that role, or see other architects?
So my title is like chief architect at Globant, and it's kind of it was an interesting thing with that because we were trying to go and figure out exactly what the title would be. And my work is really like all over the place. So I am doing consulting on architecture, periodically, but there's a lot of other aspects to it. So it's, yeah, I think I take the broader perspective that it really is organizations as well as the actual, technology, and kind of figuring out how to piece all these things together. So I'm really a very big fan of the team topologies, book and the authors. There's a lot of interesting things in there in terms of going and understanding, the decisions you have to go and make in terms of going and orienting your organization in the ways that are necessary to keep things sustainable. So yeah, I'm really so out of the mind space right now of thinking about architecture as a separate thing. It seems like it's just a matter of like, okay, these are all the processes, they all kind of tie together, and it's like, where can things be separated? What value is there to the separation? Is it better to go and merge certain things together? It all kind of ties together in that way.
I think an architecture role in an organization sometimes is thought of as prescriptive, I guess, rather than like a coaching role almost. And so I think that if an architecture role does exist in an organization, often it should be something along the lines of coaching and interacting with a team rather than,
or like even just articulating what the system is, right?
Yes.
I think that's one thing I have like a very strong bias towards descriptive rather than normative and like most everything, right? It's kind of like, I'm not the person who's gonna tell you what to do, right? If you really press me, I'll tell you what to do, but I'll basically show you what you have and what I can imagine the consequences of the current structure happen to be. And then it's like, okay, make your own decision about that.
Right.
And I think that that's one thing that's kind of funny is that within software development as a whole, we quite often have this future orientation because we're usually all about features. So the new work comes in and we don't really take much time to go and actually like reflect on where things are right now and what the consequence of taking the same courses of action would be in the future. So a lot of it is really like articulating the current state of the system. And then, then you get into that conversation about whether that's something that needs to change or not,
Yeah. And you're the second or third person who's basically given advice similar to that, is that the more you move into coaching, the less you're saying, here's the problem, here's what to do about it. You're more describing the problem very well in such a way that it helps enable people to come up with the solution, right? But you want to describe it accurately, right? Like, here's the context, here are the consequences of the current state, you know what I mean? And then what do you want to do? Totally. Something like that.
But it allows people to go and sort of have their own ownership of things. And I think that the broader thing with this too is that, the more different ways that you can see something, the more options you have, right? If you can basically sort of put on different sets of glasses for, particular scenario, say, well, I see it this way, or I see it this way, and I see it this way, then you've kind of like got more of a sense of what it really is. And then things will come to mind about what you can do going forward with things.
Yeah.
I do little experiments like this that every once in a while, like figure ground experiments. If you've ever heard of figure ground at all, but it's like this. If you've ever seen the optical illusion where basically you see the picture of a vase, which is really two faces facing each other, that kind of thing, right? And it's kind of like there's a school of psychology from the early 20th century called gestalt psychology, which is really all about perception and understanding figure ground relationships. And it's weird because sometimes you can flip things around and get a different perspective that helps you with certain things. Like, so for instance, one example, like sometimes I'll visit teams and I'll say, don't show me the code, but show me the unit test for this class. And I'll tell you whether it's a good class or not, right? Or just like, good, very quasi good way. But there's so much you can tell just by looking at the unit tests themselves, provided you know what the coverage is, right? It's like if you see really excessive setup, then it's kind of like, okay, it's really kind of obvious that the interface of this class isn't quite what it needs to be, and that like
depends on everything in the world to activate.
Yeah. So it's kind of like, it's interesting that when you tune your perception to be able to go and see these sorts of things, then you start to go and develop this stronger sense of what good design is in a way. And I think it's really a sense of aesthetics in a way. And it's kind of like when I look at like my role in the industry now, at least in ways I'm able to influence people, it's really more about getting people to understand design at that deep of a level where it's almost like, oh, okay, this kind of feels wrong, so we're just not going to go and do this. It's like, why? It's like, oh, I can give you a reason, but it's like, I kind of know, just because it's, if we can basically cohere towards stronger unified design sense in the industry, I think, it's kind of powerful. So.
Yeah, and what you said reminds me, and then we'll probably have to close in light of time, but I took a philosophy of science class, and what they talked about is the history of science isn't these like slow, gradual changes. They're gestalt switches. So using that word you said, where it was Newtonian, and then there was gestalt switch, and all of a sudden everybody was different, and it was this gestalt switch that happened. So it's interesting to think about that from a coaching perspective, that how can I make the gestalt switch happen for a team? Yeah.
Yeah. There's different ways of seeing things. I think that helps an awful lot,
Yep.
I think, being awareness of Conway's law, Dunbar's number, pointing out the examples of it when you see these things, then gets people in the unified sense of what the forces of self-development are.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Michael, is there anything that you want to share and plug before we close out the show?
Not particularly. I'm working on a couple of things in the background, but nothing really going to kind of push out more. I think there's one thing I guess I would mention is I'm working on something which is really about understanding different patterns that occur across domains. Okay. Not domains in software, but people patterns that apply in code and vice versa, and in technology and in the physical world as well. And it's a thing I'm calling forms. And so I've been doing a little bit in that space, and I need to go and basically do a bit more writing about it, but it's rather exciting to me, because essentially if you're used to looking for patterns across things, sometimes you can find patterns that are applicable in areas you wouldn't really expect, and then arrive at better solutions. So I don't have anything to point at, but I'll just go and say, if you search for Michael Feather's forms, you'll probably find something at some point that I'm going to look at.
So to all of our viewers out there, if you think that somebody that's dealing with maybe Conway's law related issues, or maybe architectural difficulties, or you think they need to know more about sociotechnical systems, point them to this video, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Thank you, everyone, and bye.
Thanks.